The document was still warm from the ink when Gilbert Watkins read the line that turned his stomach to stone. In exchange for the eastern parcel of Caldwell Flats, the undersigned hereby transfers ownership of one Alma Vaughn, unmarried, age 22, to be received by the party of the second part as agreed. He read it twice, and then a third time, not because he misunderstood the words, but because he needed a moment to believe that in the year 1873, in the territory of Kansas, a man could write those words down on paper and press his thumb to the ink like he was signing over a horse. Gilbert Watkins was 30 years old, a cattle rancher with calloused hands and a reputation for fair dealing that stretched from Dodge City to the Oklahoma line. He had ridden hard through the August heat to reach the Caldwell land office, expecting to finalize the boundary agreement on a strip of grazing land he had been negotiating for 6 months. He had not expected this. He had not, in his wildest imaginings, expected this. He set the document on the desk of Land Agent Horace Plum, a wiry man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who seemed wholly unbothered by what he had just handed over for review. "What in God's name is this, Plum?" Gilbert asked. His voice was low and controlled, the way a man keeps his voice when the alternative is raising it to a level that frightens people. Plum adjusted his spectacles and leaned back in his creaking chair. "That there is the full terms of the Caldwell agreement, Mr. Watkins. Chester Vaughn insisted the girl be included as part of the consideration. Said she was costing him money keeping her fed. He signed yesterday morning." "She is a human being," Gilbert said. Plum blinked at him as if the observation were interesting but not especially relevant. "Chester Vaughn signed her over," Plum repeated. "She is listed as part of the exchange. You receive the eastern parcel and Miss Vaughn both. Chester gets the water rights on the creek and the promissory note you agreed to." Gilbert looked at the paper again. He had lived long enough in the West to know that the law did not always catch up with the cruelty that men were capable of, and he had seen enough injustice pressed into official documents to understand that something being written down did not make it right. The Civil War had ended 8 years ago. The 13th Amendment had passed. And yet here was a piece of paper with a woman's name on it, listed between a plot of grazing land and a water rights clause, like she was a fence post included in a property transfer. He picked up the pen from Plum's desk. Plum sat forward. "Now, Mr. Watkins, I do not advise." Gilbert tore the paper cleanly down the center. Then he tore each half again. Then he dropped the 4 pieces on Plum's desk and looked at the man steadily. "Where is she?" he said. Plum stared at the pieces of paper on his desk. His mouth worked silently for a moment. "She is outside. Chester Vaughn brought her in this morning and left. Said she knew what was happening. Did she agree to it?" Plum was quiet long enough that the answer was clear even before he spoke. "Chester said she would." Gilbert pushed back from the desk and walked to the door of the land office. He stepped out into the blinding August sun of Caldwell, Kansas, and stood on the plank sidewalk, letting his eyes adjust. She was sitting on the bench at the end of the building. He almost did not see her at first because she was so still, so deliberately composed, the way a person becomes still when they are working very hard not to fall apart. She had dark auburn hair tucked under a plain brown bonnet, and she wore a calico dress that had been mended at the hem and the cuffs. She had a single carpet bag sitting between her boots, and her hands were folded in her lap with the kind of rigid precision that spoke not of peace, but of iron self-control. She looked up when she heard his boots on the planks. Her eyes were green, the particular deep green of creek water in shadow, and they were guarded in a way that made his chest ache because he recognized it, the look of someone waiting to find out how bad the next thing was going to be. "Are you Alma Vaughn?" he asked. "I am," she said. Her voice was steady and she did not look away from him. "My name is Gilbert Watkins." Something shifted in her expression. She had been expecting him. She had known his name was coming. He watched her chin lift almost imperceptibly, bracing herself. "I want you to know," he said, and he crouched down so he was at her level rather than standing over her because it seemed important that he not loom over her right now, that I have just torn up that paper. Whatever Chester Vaughn agreed to, I did not agree to it. You are not part of any land deal. You are not property, and you are not mine, and you never were. Do you understand me?" Alma Vaughn looked at him for a long moment. He could not tell what she was thinking. Her green eyes moved over his face like she was reading something written there and wasn't yet sure if she believed it. "You tore it up," she said, "into 4 pieces. They are currently on Horace Plum's desk." Something moved across her face, not quite relief, not quite yet, but the first tentative loosening of something that had been knotted very tight. "What does that mean for the land?" she asked. "Chester will not be happy." "I suspect he will not," Gilbert said. "But that is a problem between him and me, and it does not involve you." She looked at him again in that careful, measuring way. "Men do not generally tear up things that benefit them." "This did not benefit me," he said. "Not in any way I want to be benefited." She was quiet. A wagon rolled past on the street. Someone was hammering somewhere down the block. The heat was enormous and pressing, and the dust was the color of old wheat. "I do not have anywhere to go," Alma said. She said it without self-pity, just flatly, the way someone states a fact that is uncomfortable but real. "Chester sold the farm. The money goes to his debts. I have what is in that bag and $4.60. Gilbert stood up. He turned and looked out at the street for a moment, at the flat horizon of Kansas baking under the August sun. He was not a man who made decisions carelessly, but he was also not a man who walked away from a problem he could see plainly in front of him. "There is a respectable boarding house 2 blocks from here," he said. "Mrs. Clara Dean runs it. She is honest and the rates are fair. I will pay the first 2 weeks while you get your footing." Alma stood up from the bench. She was taller than he had expected, nearly reaching his chin, and when she stood she had a natural straightness to her spine that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with habit. She had spent her life not allowing herself to look small. "I do not accept charity," she said. "It is not charity," he said. "It is a correction. Someone did you a wrong, and the least I can do is put 2 weeks between you and that wrong so you can breathe." She studied him. "Why does it matter to you? You got the land. You could have taken the document and walked away, and I would have had no legal recourse, and you know it." He met her gaze. "Because it mattered to me," he said simply. "Because some things are wrong regardless of whether there is legal recourse." Alma Vaughn picked up her carpetbag. She held it with both hands, and she looked at him with those guarded green eyes, and she said, "All right, Mr. Watkins, 2 weeks, and then I will find my own way." "I have no doubt of it," he said. He walked her to Mrs. Dean's boarding house and introduced her and paid for 2 weeks in advance without making a fuss about it. And then he tipped his hat to both women and said he hoped the rest of the day treated Alma Vaughn better than the morning had. He walked back to the land office to deal with the wreckage of the Caldwell agreement and didn't look back, though he wanted to. What he did not know, walking away in the August heat with the dust rising around his boots, was that he had left something behind him on that plank sidewalk outside Mrs. Dean's boarding house, some quality of himself that he had not realized he was capable of losing. Mrs. Clara Dean was a woman of 60 with gray hair and sharp brown eyes, and the particular warmth of someone who had seen enough of the world to know when kindness was required and when it was wasted. She put Alma in a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, so it caught the morning light but not the worst of the afternoon heat. The room had a quilt on the iron bed, and a small writing desk under the window, and a rag rug on the floor. Alma set her carpetbag on the bed and sat beside it and allowed herself, for exactly 2 minutes, to put her face in her hands. She was not crying. She had not cried since the morning Chester, her uncle by marriage and the man who had been her guardian since her parents died of fever 6 years ago, had told her what he had done. She had stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse she had lived in since she was 16 and listened to him explain it, and she had felt the floor tilt under her, and then she had steadied herself and thought, with great precision, about what she needed to pack. She had not cried since then. She was not sure she was going to cry. Crying required a kind of softness. She had spent 6 years compressing down to keep it safe. She lifted her face from her hands and looked at the east window and the square of blue Kansas sky it contained. Gilbert Watkins had torn up the paper. She turned the fact over in her mind the way you turned over an interesting stone, examining it from every angle. He had received the document, read it, and destroyed it. He had come outside and crouched down to her level so she would not feel loomed over. He had paid for her room without making her feel small about accepting it. She had met men who were kind the way a tool was kind, usefully, functionally, with clear purpose. She had met very few men who were kind because they simply could not be otherwise. She did not know yet which kind Gilbert Watkins was, but she was going to think about it. Over the next 3 days, Alma Vaughn did not fold. She went to every business in Caldwell that might need a capable woman. She had a good hand with figures. She could sew and cook and keep books, and she had a natural orderliness of mind that made her useful in ways that were not always obvious at first glance. On the 3rd day, she found work at the dry goods store on Main Street, owned by a Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks, who were drowning in inventory and paperwork and needed someone to organize both. Alma organized both. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized their entire stock ledger, found 3 accounting errors that had been costing them money, and established a system for the shelving that made it possible for Mr. Hendricks to find things without asking his wife where they were. Mrs. Hendricks, a round, cheerful woman named Bess, told Alma she was a wonder, and she would be welcome to work there as long as she liked. Alma thought about what as long as she liked might mean, and felt, for the first time in years, that it was a question she was allowed to answer for herself. She was reorganizing a shelf of seed packets on Friday afternoon when the bell over the door rang and Gilbert Watkins came in. He was dressed for work, dusty from the trail, wearing a battered hat and a canvas shirt, and he moved through the store with the easy economy of a man who was comfortable in his body and his space. He did not see her at first. He was looking at Mr. Hendricks behind the counter, asking about an order of fence wire. Alma watched him from behind the seed shelf. She observed that he was polite to Mr. Hendricks in the particular way that suggested he was always polite, not performing it. She observed that he noticed the new arrangement of the store with a slight approving nod, as if he had clocked the improvement without knowing who was responsible for it. She observed that his hat was older than his boots, which was backward from how most men organized their vanity. He turned to leave and caught sight of her. Something in his expression shifted, a warmth moved through it quickly, like a lamp being lit behind a window. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Mr. Watkins," she said. He glanced at the seed shelf she was organizing. "You found work." "On Tuesday," she said. "I told you I would find my own way." "You did tell me that," he agreed. "I should not be surprised." There was a pause. She noticed that he was not filling it with noise, which was unusual in her experience of men who ran into women they had been thinking about. He just stood with his hat in his hands and let the pause exist, which she found unexpectedly comfortable. "How is the land situation?" she asked. He shifted his weight slightly. "Complicated." Chester Vaughn did not respond well to the news that the agreement was void. He has hired a lawyer out of Wichita and is arguing that because the underlying consideration, the water rights and the promissory note, was already tendered, the agreement stands in modified form. Can he do that? He is trying to. I have my own lawyer. It will take time to resolve. He paused. I want you to know that the land dispute is entirely separate from anything that affects you. Whatever happens with the legal argument, you are not part of it. Chester Vaughn signed something he had no right to sign, and that is between him and his conscience. Alma looked at him steadily. His conscience is not a very well-populated place. The corner of Gilbert's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the motion that precedes a smile in a man who is not sure he is allowed to be amused yet. "No," he agreed. "I don't expect it is." He put his hat back on his head. "I am glad you are well situated, Miss Vaughn. I hope Caldwell is treating you decently." "Decently enough," she said. He nodded and turned to go and then turned back, which seemed involuntary, like the gesture had gotten ahead of the decision. There is a supper at the Cattlemen's Hall next Saturday. It is nothing formal, just the ranchers and their families and some of the town people. Mrs. Dean usually attends. I wondered if you might like to go. Not, he paused and recalibrated. I am not proposing anything beyond a chance to meet people who might be useful to know. It is a small town, and knowing the right people makes a difference. Alma looked at him. The supper was clearly also a social event, and she was clearly a woman without family in this town, and asking her to attend a community supper was clearly an act of social inclusion that would do her reputation some good. It was also, she was fairly certain, something he wanted to do because he wanted to see her in a setting that was not a dry goods store. I will ask Mrs. Dean, she said. He nodded, looked mildly relieved, and left. Bess Hendricks materialized from the back room where she had absolutely been listening. That is Gilbert Watkins, she said, in the tone of someone presenting important information. I know, Alma said, and went back to the seed packets. He is one of the best men in the county, Bess continued. I am organizing seeds, Mrs. Hendricks. He lost his wife 4 years ago, fever. He has been running the ranch alone since then. Alma set down a packet of squash seeds and looked at her employer, Mrs. Hendricks. I am just saying, Bess said, and went back to the stock room. The Saturday supper at the Cattlemen's Hall was lit by 3 hanging lanterns and a fireplace and smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, and there were perhaps 40 people in the room when Alma arrived with Mrs. Dean. She had done her hair carefully and put on her second dress, which was a deep blue-green, the color of cedar shadow, and she wore the small garnet earrings that had belonged to her mother and were the one thing of value she owned. She was aware, almost immediately, that several people in the room knew who she was, not in a malicious way, but in the particular way of small frontier communities where news traveled faster than horses. She was the woman Chester Vaughn had tried to sign over in a land deal. She was the woman Gilbert Watkins had refused. She held her chin level and let Mrs. Dean introduce her to everyone with warm authority, and she was pleasant and composed and said the right things, and all the while she was acutely aware of the moment Gilbert Watkins came through the door. He cleaned up differently than she would have expected. The battered hat was replaced by a newer one, and he wore a dark vest over a clean white shirt, and he had shaved the trail dust off so she could see the clean line of his jaw and the deeper set of his eyes, which were the particular gray of storm clouds on the edge of the horizon, not threatening, just large and full of weather. He moved through the room greeting people with that same consistent warmth she had noticed before, and she watched him the way you watch something you are trying to understand. And then he found her across the room, and the warmth in his expression did something that made her look away first. He worked his way toward her eventually, because it was that kind of evening, and she was standing near the table with the bread, and he took a piece and said, I am glad you came. Mrs. Dean was enthusiastic, Alma said. Mrs. Dean is enthusiastic about most good things, he said. They stood together and ate bread and watched the room. She told him about reorganizing the seed shelf and discovered he had opinions about seed organization that were agricultural and practical and faintly funny, and she found herself smiling, which surprised her enough that she looked at the bread in her hand for a moment to collect herself. You do not smile very often, he observed. I smile when something is worth smiling about, she said. Is that a high bar or a realistic one? Realistic, she said. I have had a somewhat practical education in what is worth smiling about. He was quiet for a moment, and she sensed he was thinking about Chester Vaughn and the carpetbag and the bench outside the land office, but he did not say any of it, which she appreciated. She did not want to be a tragedy in his mind. She wanted to be a person. Tell me about the ranch, she said, because she genuinely wanted to know, and because changing the subject felt necessary. His face changed in the way faces change when someone is given permission to talk about something they love. He told her about the eastern parcel, which was the disputed land, good flat grazing ground along a seasonal creek that would be excellent for cattle in the spring. He told her about the main ranch house, which he had built himself with 3 other men over 2 summers, and the fact that it currently had an excellent front porch and a leaking corner of the roof that he had been meaning to fix for months. He told her about his cattle operation with the particular modest pride of a man who had built something real from almost nothing. She listened with the attention she gave to things that interested her, which was considerable, and he seemed to notice it, and it seemed to matter to him. When the fiddle started up and people began to dance, he looked at her and said, "I am not a very graceful man." "Neither am I," she said. "Do you want to try being graceless together?" She did. It turned out that they were both better than they had advertised, and the fiddle was cheerful and the room was warm, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Alma Vaughn laughed freely in a room full of people, and the sound of it surprised her so much she stopped dancing for half a step. Gilbert caught her elbow lightly to steady her. His hand was warm and careful and dropped away the moment she had her footing. "All right?" he asked. "I had forgotten I could sound like that," she said. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and there was something in them she did not examine too closely, because she had only known him for 11 days, and she was not the kind of woman who made quick decisions with her heart. She was, however, the kind of woman who noticed things, and she noticed everything about Gilbert Watkins with an attention she had not given to anything in a very long time. The legal matter of the Chester Vaughn dispute resolved in September, 6 weeks after the evening at the Caldwell land office. Gilbert's lawyer successfully argued that the transfer document had been void from the inception, because no person could be lawfully included as consideration in a property exchange, and that the destruction of the document had been legally inconsequential since the document itself had no standing. Chester Vaughn's lawyer countered with 3 different arguments and lost all 3. Chester retained the water rights on the creek and received a reduced promissory note, and Gilbert received the eastern parcel, and nobody mentioned Alma Vaughn in the court proceedings because she was not property and her name did not belong in them. Chester came through Caldwell in September on his way to wherever he was going next. Gilbert heard he was heading to Colorado, and Alma did not see him. She found out he had come and gone when Mrs. Dean mentioned it carefully over breakfast, watching Alma's face. Alma spread jam on her toast and said, "Good," and meant it simply, and that was the end of Chester Vaughn in her story. What grew instead was something she had not planned for and could not entirely have prevented even if she had tried, which she did try, moderately, because she was a careful woman. Gilbert Watkins came into the dry goods store every Friday. At first he was buying things fence wire, grain sacks, salt blocks. Then Bess Hendricks, who was an unapologetic romantic, began ordering things she knew he would need so that he would have a reason to come in on Fridays. Gilbert understood perfectly well what Bess was doing and found it funny and came in on Fridays anyway. He and Alma talked. That was all at first. They talked about the ranch and the weather and the town and the various small dramas of Caldwell life, and they discovered that they thought about things in compatible ways, not identically, because that would have been dull, but in ways that made the conversation expand rather than contract. He challenged her sometimes and she challenged him back, and neither of them found it threatening. In October he asked if she would like to ride out to see the eastern parcel, since she had heard so much about it. She borrowed a horse from Mr. Hendricks, who was also now invested in the situation, and they rode out in the gold and copper afternoon light of a Kansas October. The eastern parcel was beautiful in the way flat land can be beautiful when the light lies across it at the right angle. The seasonal creek ran low in October, but the grass along it was still green, and the prairie spread out in every direction with the vast indifference of something that did not need to impress anyone. They dismounted at the creek and stood watching the water move over the stones. A red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal high overhead, patient and unbothered. "This was worth fighting for," Alma said. "Most things worth keeping are worth fighting for," he said. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling October air. She looked at the creek and thought about how it was strange to be standing in the middle of a piece of land that had once included her name in a legal document, and how it was stranger still that standing here felt not like a wound but like something healed and clean. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you tore up that paper, in the moment, not after thinking about it, what made you do it?" Most men would have found a reason not to. He was quiet for a moment. The hawk drifted east. The creek moved over its stones with small, patient sounds. "My mother," he said finally. "She was a good woman, and she was treated like she was worth less than she was by almost every institution she encountered, because of what she was and where she came from and what she had. I watched her navigate that her whole life with more grace than it deserved. And I promised myself when I was about 15 that I would not be a man who looked away from injustice because it was convenient to look away." Alma looked at him. The October light was on his face and the gray of his eyes was warm rather than stormy in the afternoon softness. "That is a very good answer," she said. "It is the true one," he said. She looked back at the creek. After a moment she said quietly, "My parents were good people. They died when I was 16. Chester Vaughn married my mother's sister the year before they died, and he was the only family I had after. He was not a bad man in some ways. He fed me and kept a roof over my head. But he never saw me as anything other than a problem to be managed." "I'm sorry," Gilbert said. "I am not telling you for sympathy," she said. "I am telling you because," she paused, organizing the words carefully, "because I have spent 6 years learning to take up as little space as possible so that I would not be inconvenient. And I find that being around you, I keep forgetting to do that." He turned to look at her. The honesty of what she had just said was sitting between them, and she felt the exposure of it, the slight vulnerability, and she met it with her chin level because she had not come this far to be afraid of her own truth. "That is a very good thing," he said softly. "I am beginning to think so," she said. The ride back to Caldwell in the failing light was companionable and quiet, and when he helped her down from her horse at the Hendricks stable, his hand stayed at her waist one moment longer than was strictly necessary for the task, and her hand stayed on his shoulders one moment longer than that, and they looked at each other in the autumn dusk with the understanding that something had begun formally, whether they had decided to begin it or not. He called on her properly the following Sunday at Mrs. Dean's boarding house, with Mrs. Dean acting as chaperone in the parlor with exquisite tactfulness. She positioned herself near the window with a book and only appeared to be reading approximately half the time. They sat in the parlor and talked for 2 hours, and what happened in those 2 hours was the accelerated version of what had been building for 8 weeks. The careful walls came slightly down, the careful distance between them shortened, and by the time he stood to go and held her hand for the formal goodbye, she was aware that she was in considerable trouble, in the best possible way. He came back the following Sunday and the one after that. They walked in the town on the 3rd Sunday, in the pale November light, bundled against the cold, and she told him about her childhood before her parents died, the farm in Missouri, the smell of her mother's kitchen, her father's laugh, which had been enormous and ridiculous, and the best sound she had ever known. She had not talked about any of this in years. The words came out a little rusty at first, and then more fluidly, and Gilbert listened with the attention of someone who understood that being trusted with someone's grief was an honor. He told her about his wife Sarah, who had died of fever 4 years before. He told her about Sarah carefully and with a love that had settled into something clean and resolved, and Alma understood that he was not haunted by it anymore, that he had done his grieving and reached the other side, where you carry the love without the pain. She respected him very much for the way he talked about it. "I was not sure I wanted to care for someone again," he said, on a cold November afternoon, walking along the street with the wind sharp out of the north. "Not because of Sarah, but because losing someone you love is a particular kind of education in your own vulnerability. It makes you cautious." "I know something about caution," she said. "I imagine you do," he said. He paused. I find that I am considerably less cautious than I intended to be where you are concerned. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something it had not done in years, something warm and frightening and wonderful. I find the same thing, she said. He stopped walking. The wind moved between them, and the November sky was the color of pewter, and the bare branches of the elm trees along the road rattled faintly. He took her hand, which he had done before, but this time he held it differently, with a deliberateness, a conscious claiming that was different from the casual touch of a friend. "Alma," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you formally if you are willing. Not for any reason except that I would like to spend more time with you, and I would like to do it honestly, in a way that is clear about what it means." She looked at him in the pewter November light, with the elm branches rattling and the wide Kansas sky above them, and she felt something unlock in her chest, some final piece of caution that had been holding everything at arm's length for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "I am willing," she said. He smiled then fully, and it transformed his face entirely. She had seen the corner of the mouth motion before, the almost smile, the careful mirth. This was different. This was the full thing, unguarded, and it reached his eyes, and she thought that she wanted to be the reason for that look for as long as she possibly could. The formal courtship changed Caldwell's social atmosphere considerably. Mrs. Dean was quietly triumphant. Bess Hendricks told her husband in a tone of complete personal vindication that she had known from the first Friday, and Mr. Hendricks said yes, dear, and continued reading his paper. The ranchers and their wives who had met Alma at the Cattlemen's Hall supper approved, because Gilbert Watkins was well regarded, and Alma Vaughn had proven herself capable and steady in the 6 weeks since her arrival. Chester Vaughn was in Colorado and did not enter into it. December in Caldwell was cold and clear, and the prairie turned the color of dry wheat under a sky that was an impossible deep blue. Gilbert drove Alma out to the ranch for the first time on a December Saturday, on the buckboard, bundled in a blanket with her shoulder against his, and the horse moving steadily through the frost-crisp air. The ranch house was solid and square and built from good lumber, and it had the excellent front porch he had described, and the leaking corner of the roof, which was currently sealed against the winter with tar paper and optimism. Inside it was warm and somewhat Spartan, a man's house, clean but without decoration, with a good stone fireplace and a long kitchen table and a parlor with 2 chairs and a bookshelf with perhaps 30 books. Alma stood in the middle of the parlor and looked around with the eye of someone who could see what was missing and what it might become. "You need curtains," she said. "I have been meaning to get curtains," he said, "and a rug in here. The floors are cold." "I have a rug." "Where?" He thought about it. "It may be in the barn." She turned to look at him with the green eyes dancing, and he started to laugh, and she started to laugh, and it was easy and real, and the house seemed to warm around it. He showed her the land, what he could show her in winter, the fields under frost, the cattle in the south pasture, the creek that ran behind the eastern parcel, now legally and fully his. He was proud of it in a quiet, deep way that was not boasting but love, and she understood love of land because she had grown up with it. And they stood at the fence looking out over the white-gold winter prairie, and she felt a belonging that she had not felt in 6 years, and it was frightening because it mattered too much to be careless with. He drove her back to Caldwell in the blue December dusk with the stars beginning to appear, and when he helped her down from the buckboard at Mrs. Dean's, he held her hands and looked at her with the steady gray eyes and said, "I want you to be happy, Alma. Whatever happens, I need you to know that." "I know it," she said, and she did. January brought a hard spell, 2 weeks of bitter cold that drove everyone indoors and made the cattle miserable, and the roads nearly impassable. Gilbert came to town when he could, and on the Sundays he could not make it. He sent notes by way of whoever was traveling the road, and Alma read them at the writing desk in her east-facing room and wrote back in her careful, clear hand, and discovered that Gilbert Watkins on paper was as honest and warm and occasionally funny as Gilbert Watkins in person, which she had half expected but was grateful to confirm. She wrote him a letter in the second week of January that was longer than she intended and more honest than she planned, in which she said that she had spent 6 years not allowing herself to want things, because wanting things she could not have had only ever hurt her, and that she found herself now wanting things, a home, a life, a future that she had some say in with an urgency that sometimes frightened her. She stopped short of saying what specifically she wanted, but she suspected from the honesty of what she had written that he would understand. His response arrived on a Tuesday, short and direct and very like him. I understand. I want those things too, and I want them with you, and I am not afraid of that, and I hope you won't be either. She held the letter and looked out the east window at the white January sky and permitted herself to want things without apology. February came with more cold, and then a sudden warm spell in the middle of the month that was the prairie teasing spring before yanking it back. On the warm day, a Sunday, Gilbert drove her out to the ranch again, and the thaw had made everything muddy and honest-looking in the way February mud is honest. The world stripped of its winter prettiness and showing what was underneath. They walked the eastern parcel in the mud, which ruined her boot hems and his boots both, and he showed her where the creek would run full in spring, and where the grass would come up green first, and where he intended to build a new fence line. She had begun to understand land the way he understood it, from hearing him talk about it, and she could follow the vision of what he saw when he looked at the flat February mud. He stopped at the creek and turned to her, and she knew from the particular quality of his stillness that he was going to say something important. I spoke to Reverend James last week, he said. She looked at him. I wanted to understand the process, he said, for obtaining a marriage license in Caldwell County. I wanted to know because I intended to ask you, and I did not want to ask you without knowing the practical answer to the question when you asked it. Alma looked at him in the February mud beside the creek on the eastern parcel of land that had once had her name written on it in ink, and she felt something rise in her chest that was so large and warm that it pressed against the inside of her ribs. You researched the process before asking, she said. I am a practical man, he said. You are, she agreed. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple band with a small oval garnet, red as winter berries. This was my mother's, he said. She left it to me when she passed 3 years ago. She said I would know when it was right. I know when it is right. Alma looked at the ring and then at his face and then at the ring again, and all the careful practical composure that had kept her together for 6 years did something she had not expected. It did not break. It did not fall away. It simply stepped aside, quietly and without fanfare, to make room for something better. Alma Vaughn, he said, will you marry me? Yes, she said. She said it without hesitation, without the careful calculation, without checking it against her caution first. She said it the way she had finally learned to say things, from the truth of herself, which was the only place worth speaking from. He put the ring on her finger, and it was a little loose but warm from his pocket, and he held her hand in both of his and looked at her with the full, unguarded smile and those storm-gray eyes full of something she now had the language for. He looked at her like she was everything he had been careful about wanting and the relief of finally having it. She stepped forward and he opened his arms and she put her face against his chest and he held her in the February mud beside the creek, and the prairie spread out in every direction, enormous and cold and indifferent and beautiful. You know, she said against his coat, the first time I saw you, I was waiting to find out how bad the next thing was going to be. And, he said, it was the best thing, she said. They were married in March, when the first green was coming up in the Kansas prairie, and the creek on the eastern parcel was running full and clear. Reverend James performed the ceremony in the Caldwell church with Mrs. Dean and the Hendricks family and half the town present, because Caldwell had adopted Alma as one of its own in the month since August and they wanted to be there. Alma wore her blue-green dress altered and pressed, and she wore her mother's garnet earrings. Gilbert wore a new suit that he had ordered from the merchant in Wichita, and he stood at the front of the church with his hat in his hands looking like a man who could not quite believe his luck, which was exactly how he felt. When Reverend James said the words that made them husband and wife and Gilbert turned to her with that full, unguarded smile, Alma Vaughn, Alma Watkins now, felt the last locked thing inside her open completely. And what was inside it was not grief or caution or survival, but something warm and boundless that she recognized, distantly, as herself. They kissed in front of the congregation, and Mrs. Dean pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, and Bess Hendricks gripped her husband's arm and said, quietly and with great satisfaction, "First Friday. I knew it on the first Friday." And Mr. Hendricks patted her hand and agreed, and it was right. The ranch became a home by degrees, the way real homes become themselves slowly, through use and love and the accumulation of ordinary days. The rug came out of the barn and went on the parlor floor, where it turned out to be perfectly good, just dusty. Curtains went up on the windows, a deep blue-green that Bess Hendricks helped Alma sew over 3 evenings. The bookshelf gained more books. The kitchen table, which had been clean and bare, gathered the comfortable clutter of a life being lived on it. Letters and seed catalogs, and the occasional coffee ring left by a cup set down in a hurry. Alma discovered she loved the ranch in the particular way she had loved the farm of her childhood, with her hands and her attention, with a physical engagement in its daily needs. She learned the cattle alongside Gilbert, learned the seasonal rhythms of the land, learned the creek's personality in all its moods. She was not a woman who sat inside while the world happened outside, and Gilbert had never wanted her to be. They worked side by side in the spring planting and the summer checking of the fence lines and the autumn gathering of the cattle, and they talked constantly. About the land, about the future, about the town, about ideas, about the books on the shelf and the letters that came from the world beyond Kansas. And in the evenings on the excellent front porch, with the prairie going gold in the setting sun, they sat in the 2 chairs Gilbert had moved outside when the weather allowed, and they were simply with each other in the way of people who have found the other half of their peace. He fixed the leaking corner of the roof in April. She told him she was expecting their child in July, on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, over coffee. He set down his cup with enormous care and looked at her with the gray eyes full of something that had no name that was adequate, and she smiled at him, the full, unreserved smile that had surprised her so much the night of the cattlemen's hall supper. And he stood up and came around the table and held her face in his hands and kissed her, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the warm July kitchen while the morning came through the curtains. He was going to be a father. She was going to be a mother. The ranch was going to have a child in it. Alma's pregnancy was straightforward, and she refused to be treated as fragile, which Gilbert navigated with the specific skill of a man who understood that respecting her meant trusting her to know her own limits. He was attentive without hovering and present without smothering, and she loved him with a fullness that continued to grow in ways she had not known were possible, as if love were a landscape that expanded the more you walked in it. Their son was born in March, 1 year after their wedding, in the room with the east-facing window at the ranch house, attended by Mrs. Dean, who had insisted on being present, and the Caldwell doctor, a steady man named Dr. Ferris. He was born on a March morning when the first green was coming up in the prairie, the same timing as the wedding, which Gilbert noted with the particular satisfaction of a man who notices patterns. They named him James Robert Watkins James for the reverend who had married them, Robert for Gilbert's father. He was small and loud, and had a dusting of auburn hair so faint it was barely there, and Gilbert held him with the careful wonder of a man holding something irreplaceable, and looked at Alma over the baby's head with the full, unguarded smile and the gray eyes fully full, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. James Robert grew with the speed that infants have, which is to say alarming and constant, and the ranch grew around him. By the time James was walking, the fence line was extended and the creek parcel had a small secondary structure for equipment storage, and the cattle herd had grown by 14 head, and the front porch had acquired a third chair. The town of Caldwell grew too, in those years following the cattle trade boom, and the Watkins Ranch was part of its fabric, well known, well regarded, part of the landscape of the county in the way that good things become part of a landscape. Quietly, through being consistently there, Alma became a figure in the town in her own right. She had continued to help Bess Hendricks in the dry goods store for 2 years after the marriage, taking James with her in a basket and later in a carrier, and eventually on her hip, and she had a head for the business that Bess relied on. When the Hendricks retired in 1876 and sold the store, the buyers, a young couple from Ohio, named the Parsons, kept Alma on as a business advisor for the first year of their ownership because they were smart enough to know what they didn't know. She also became the person that women new to Caldwell were brought to meet, because she was known as someone who could help you get your footing, find work, find housing, navigate the particular challenges of arriving somewhere without much resource. She did this without drama or self-congratulation, the same way Gilbert had helped her, because she understood it from the inside, and because it seemed to her the obvious right thing to do. There was a woman named Margaret Ellery who arrived in Caldwell in 1876 in circumstances that were not entirely unlike Alma's own, and Alma sat with her in Mrs. Dean's parlor. Mrs. Dean was still taking in boarders at 63, indomitable and cheerful, and talked her through the available options with the practical directness that she herself had wished for when she was sitting on that bench outside the land office with a carpetbag between her boots. Margaret Ellery found work and found footing and eventually found her own happiness, and she told people for years afterward that Alma Watkins had been the first person to make her feel like a person rather than a problem, and that it had made all the difference. Gilbert heard about this secondhand because Alma did not mention it, and he looked at her across the supper table that evening and said, "Margaret Ellery says you saved her life." Alma handed James a piece of bread and said, "I gave her practical information. She saved her own life." "You sound like someone else I know," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "When I tore up that paper," he said, "I told you it was just a correction. You told me it made all the difference." Alma was quiet for a moment. James ate his bread with the focused intensity of a 2-year-old for whom bread is the most important object in existence. "You are comparing yourself to me," she said. "I am observing that we are similar kinds of people," he said. "That is either very good or very alarming," she said. "I have found it to be very good," he said. She smiled at him across the supper table with the curtain she had sewn in the blue-green light, and the rug from the barn on the floor and the bookshelf, full on the wall, and James between them with his bread. And she thought about the bench outside the land office, and the carpetbag, and the August heat, and the piece of paper torn into 4 pieces on Horace Plum's desk. And she felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite wonder, but contained both of them. A deep, warm, abiding recognition that the trajectory of her life had turned on a single act of decency, and that the man sitting across from her had performed that act not because he expected anything from it, but because he could not have done otherwise. She loved him for that. She loved him for the fence line and the fixed roof and the rug and the curtains and the third chair on the porch, and the way he held James like something irreplaceable, and the way he listened with his whole attention, and the way he had crouched down to her level on the plank sidewalk so she would not feel loomed over. She loved him in every practical, specific detail, which was the only way she knew how to love, fully, concretely, with her eyes open. Their second child arrived in 1877, a girl this time, born in the autumn with a full head of auburn hair much more definitive than James's had been. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Dean, who received the news with such dignified emotion that she had to sit down. Clara Watkins arrived in the world with strong opinions and a loud voice, and a face that was entirely her mother's. And James, now 3, regarded her with the cautious interest of a child who has been told this is a good development but is withholding judgment. The ranch in the autumn of 1877 was a place of considerable noise and activity. Gilbert had taken on 2 ranch hands, a man named Tom Briggs, who was steady and capable, and a younger man called Eddie Marsh who was learning, and the operation had grown to the point where it required more hands than just the 2 of them could provide. The house held the noise and the life that it had been built for, the east window catching the morning light on Clara's cradle and James's toys on the parlor rug, and the coffee on the kitchen table where Alma and Gilbert sat most mornings before the day fully started. Those mornings were their own, a private space before the household woke and the work began, when they talked in low voices about the day ahead and the month ahead, and sometimes the life ahead. And Gilbert would refill her coffee before she asked for it, because after 4 years he knew when she needed it. And she would have his breakfast ready before he came in from the early check on the cattle because she knew his timing. And it was the accumulated knowledge of 2 people who had paid attention to each other. "I have been thinking," Alma said one morning in October of 1877, with Clara sleeping in the cradle and James still asleep upstairs and the autumn light coming through the kitchen window. "Always a significant event," Gilbert said. She made the motion of throwing a dish towel at him that she sometimes made when he was particularly pleased with himself. "I have been thinking about buying the Hendricks building." He looked at her over his coffee. "The dry goods building. The Parsons have been struggling. They might be willing to sell at a reasonable price. I know the inventory, I know the suppliers, I know the customers. I could run it profitably." "You could," he said, without hesitation. "You absolutely could. You don't think it is too much, with the children and the ranch and Alma," he said. "Do I look like a man who is going to tell you what is too much for you?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "Good," he said. "Then make me an offer." She bought the building in December after 3 weeks of negotiation with the Parsons that ended with all parties satisfied, which was Alma's standard for a good deal. She hired a woman named Ruth Garfield as her assistant. Ruth had 3 children and needed income, and had a quick mind and good hands, and opened as Watkins Dry Goods in January of 1878 with a reorganized stock, accurate ledgers, and the best seed selection in the county. Bess Hendricks came to the opening and stood in the middle of the store and looked around at the organized shelves and the clear signage and the new counter with its brass fittings, and she said, with complete satisfaction, "It is better than when we had it." "It really is not," Alma said. "It absolutely is," Bess said, and hugged her, and Alma let herself be hugged with a fullness that would have surprised the woman she had been on the bench outside the land office in August of 1873. The years settled into a rhythm that was the rhythm of a good life, full and varied, and not without difficulty. Because good lives are not without difficulty. They are simply lives in which the difficulty is met with sufficient strength and sufficient company. James grew into a serious, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch, with the focused intentionality of someone taking detailed notes on how to eventually take over the operation. He was 8 years old and already knew more about cattle than most grown men Gilbert had employed, and he had his mother's green eyes and his father's patience, which was a useful combination. Clara grew into a child of enormous enthusiasm and very few fears, which kept everyone somewhat on their toes. She was 5 and had already fallen out of 2 trees and ridden the old ranch dog like a horse and befriended every stray cat in the county. She had Gilbert's gray eyes and Alma's auburn hair and her own personality, which belonged to no one but herself. Gilbert had gray at his temples now, the particular distinguished gray that comes at the sides first, and it suited him, and Alma told him so, which made him look pleased in the way he always looked pleased when she said something kind to him, slightly surprised, which still, after 5 years, surprised her. He was a man who had given a great deal of kindness without necessarily having expected to receive it back, and she had made it her private intention to correct this imbalance as thoroughly as possible. In the spring of 1879, they planted a kitchen garden together for the first time. They had always had a vegetable patch, but this was more ambitious, with 6 kinds of vegetables and an herb section, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence that Alma wanted for no reason other than that sunflowers were enormous and cheerful, and she felt the property deserved more of both. They planted it on a Saturday with the children nominally helping, which in practice meant James planted carefully, and Clara redistributed the seed packets without regard for the organizational system. Gilbert followed behind Clara with patient amusement and resorted what he could. "She is going to be trouble," he said, watching Clara attempt to plant an entire packet of squash seeds in one hole. "She is already trouble," Alma said. "She is magnificent trouble." "She gets it from her mother," he said. Alma looked at him with the green eyes bright. "Excuse me, the magnificence," he said. "Obviously the magnificence." She threw a clod of garden dirt at him. He caught it just barely and laughed, and James looked up from his careful planting with the expression of a child who has concluded that adults are genuinely incomprehensible. The sunflowers came up in August, enormous and gold, turning their faces to the light with an authority that Alma found entirely satisfying. She cut several and put them in a jar on the kitchen table, and they made the kitchen look the way she had always wanted a kitchen to look, lived in and happy and full of something growing. Gilbert came in from the fields that evening and stopped in the doorway looking at the table, at the sunflowers and the supper laid out, and the children's voices coming from upstairs. And Alma, who was at the stove, turned and saw his expression and felt it the way she felt most things that mattered, in the specific warm weight of it, in its detail and its truth. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He came to the stove and kissed her temple in the way he had that was so ordinary and so present and so entirely his. "Nothing at all. Everything is very right." "It is," she said. She leaned back against him briefly, his arm coming around her from behind, both of them looking at the kitchen and the sunflowers and the evening light coming in through the curtains. And she thought about the bench and the carpet bag and the August heat of 1873, and she thought about the piece of paper torn into 4 pieces, and she thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, and how the distance had been traveled not in one great dramatic stride but in 1,000 small specific acts of decency and attention and love. She turned in the circle of his arm and looked up at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Yes," he said. "When I was sitting on that bench waiting for you to come out of the land office," she said, "I was the most alone I had ever been in my life. Not because I was without people, but because I had given up expecting that anything in the world was going to help me rather than manage me. And then you came out and you crouched down and she stopped." He was very still. He was listening with his whole self. "I knew in that moment," she said, "that you were different. I did not know how different. I did not know yet what I was going to feel for you. But I knew that something was going to change, and I knew it because you made me feel like a person. Before you said a single word about the paper. Just by the way you stood." His eyes were full. He was not a man who cried easily, but she had learned over 5 years the particular quality of his full attention when something had reached the core of him, and she saw it now. "Alma," he said. "I love you," she said. "I love you specifically, every particular detail of you. I love you because you tore up a piece of paper, and I love you because you fixed the roof, and I love you because you know when I need coffee, and I love you because you follow Clara around the garden resorting seeds without complaining. I love every single specific ordinary thing about you, and I want you to know that." He held her face in his hands the way he had on their wedding day, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You are the finest thing that ever came into my life, and I include the eastern parcel." She laughed, which she suspected was his intention, and the laughter was warm and full and easy, and he was smiling the full unguarded smile, and the sunflowers were on the table, and upstairs James and Clara were arguing about something with the passionate investment of children who are entirely safe and entirely loved. This was the life. This specific, irreplaceable particular life. Not the life that had been pressed onto paper without her consent, not the life that Chester Vaughn had tried to parcel off with water rights and grazing land, but the life she had built, day by day, in this place, with this man, on this land. In October of 1879, Mrs. Clara Dean retired from the boarding house and moved in with her niece in Wichita, and the whole of Caldwell turned out to say goodbye. She hugged Alma for a long time at the depot and told her she was proud of her in a way that pressed on something tender and good. "You came here with nothing," Mrs. Dean said, "and look what you built." "I had help," Alma said. "You had the building blocks," Mrs. Dean said. "You laid the mortar yourself." The train took her to Wichita, and Alma watched it go until it was a thread of smoke on the horizon, and Gilbert stood beside her with his hand in hers, and the Kansas sky was enormous above them. "She is right," he said. "You did not hear what she said." "I know what she said," he said. Alma looked at the horizon where the smoke had been. "I am going to miss her very much." "We will visit," he said, "in the spring when the road is good." They did visit in the spring of 1880, driving to Wichita with both children and a week's provisions, and Mrs. Dean was bright and comfortable and clearly happy with her niece, and she spoiled James and Clara with the focused intensity of someone who has saved up spoiling for a specific purpose. The drive back to Caldwell was long, and the children slept in the back of the wagon, and the spring prairie spread out on every side with the particular gold green of new growth under the late afternoon sun, and Alma sat close against Gilbert's side on the wagon bench with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, watching the land go by. "I am happy," she said. It was a simple statement, and she meant it to be, because the most important truths are often the simplest ones. "So am I," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in the golden spring light, with the children sleeping and the horses moving steadily, and the wide Kansas sky above them turning every shade of pink and amber and deep burning orange as the sun went down. And when they pulled up to the ranch house with its excellent front porch and its fixed roof and its curtains in the windows, the sight of it with the last light on it was the most beautiful thing either of them had seen. Tom Briggs had kept the fire going, and there was coffee on the stove, which was exactly what was needed. Gilbert carried James inside, still sleeping, while Alma carried Clara, and they put the children in their beds with the practiced efficiency of parents who had done this 100 times, and then they stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet of the settled house. "Tea," Gilbert said. "Please," Alma said. They sat in the parlor with their tea and the rug on the floor and the bookshelf, full on the wall and the curtains drawn against the night, and they talked about the visit, and the trip, and the road and the spring grass they had seen, and eventually the conversation slowed and they sat in the comfortable quiet of people who do not need to fill silence to feel connected. The fire settled. The house breathed around them. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars. Alma looked at her husband in the firelight, at the gray at his temples, and the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, and the hands that knew when she needed coffee, and how to hold a newborn, and how to fix a leaking roof, and how to tear a piece of paper into 4 pieces when the world asked him to do something wrong. She loved him with every year they had accumulated, and she knew, with the certainty that she had learned to trust in herself, that she would love him with every year that was still to come. Their third child came in the winter of 1881, another boy, born in January with a full head of dark hair like his father's had been before the gray came. They named him William, and James received him with the satisfaction of a 9-year-old who has decided that another boy is the correct outcome, and Clara received him with the enthusiasm of a 6-year-old for whom any new creature is welcome. William was a calm baby, which was a relief after Clara's first year of magnificent noise, and he watched the world with the gray eyes he had inherited with a thoughtfulness that made Gilbert say, He was going to be a philosopher or a rancher, and that both were respectable. The Watkins dry goods store continued to do well through the early 1880s, and Ruth Garfield had become a full partner in management, and Alma had expanded the seed section to be the finest in the county, and had developed a reputation for honest dealing that brought people from 20 miles away. She did the books herself on Sunday evenings at the kitchen table while Gilbert read and the children variously slept or argued at lower volumes, and she found the precise orderliness of ledgers deeply satisfying in a way that was particular to her nature. She had come a long way from the woman who had $4.60 and a carpetbag. She had not forgotten that woman. She kept her in mind deliberately, the way you keep a landmark in sight to know where you are, not as a wound, but as a reference point. She had been that woman, and she was this woman now, and the distance between them had been made by work and luck and love, and one afternoon in August when a man she had never met had crouched down to her eye level on a plank sidewalk and told her she was not property. She thought about the injustice of that paper sometimes, in the way you think about a scar, not constantly, but when the light catches it. She thought about the fact that the law had not protected her, that a man had been able to write her name in a document like a piece of furniture, and that the only reason it had not destroyed her was a single act of individual decency. She thought about how many women there were who had not had that act of decency, who had been delivered to what they were delivered to and had no one to tear the paper. She thought about this, and she let it make her purposeful rather than bitter, because bitterness was a luxury she had never been able to afford and didn't want, and purpose was something she had in considerable supply. In 1882, when James was 10 and already managing the morning cattle check with his father, and Clara was 7 and in school with opinions about everything, and William was crawling into everything with terrifying speed, Alma organized the first meeting of the Caldwell Women's Practical Aid Society, which was not a temperance organization or a church auxiliary, but a simple practical thing. Women who had resources helping women who needed them. She ran it the way she ran the ledgers, clearly, without excess sentiment, with attention to actual results. Gilbert told her at supper one evening that he was proud of her, the way he sometimes said things directly without prelude. "I have not done anything yet," she said. "You have done it for 9 years," he said. "You just made it official." She looked at him across the table with the 3 children at various stages of eating their supper, and felt the familiar warm weight of being known, of being seen by someone who had paid attention long enough and honestly enough to actually see. "You are a good man, Gilbert Watkins," she said. "You are a remarkable woman, Alma Watkins," he said. James looked between his parents with the resigned expression of a 10-year-old who has concluded that his parents are occasionally embarrassing. Clara said, "Are you going to kiss?" in the interested tone of a 7-year-old for whom this is entertainment. William banged his spoon on the table with the focused joy of a small person who has recently discovered that things make noise. They kissed, to Clara's satisfaction, and the evening continued, and the house was full of the sound of a family at supper, which was an ordinary sound and a remarkable one, and Alma Watkins knew the difference. She knew the difference every single day. In the autumn of 1883, 10 years after the August morning in Caldwell, when the world had tried to write her name on a piece of paper between a land parcel and a water rights clause, Alma stood on the front porch of the ranch house in the October light with her coffee in her hands and looked out at the prairie. The sunflowers were done for the year, their brown faces bowed. The cattle were in the south pasture. James was out with his father and Tom Briggs doing the fence line. Clara was at school. William was inside, napping with the complete dedication of a 2-year-old. The prairie in October was the color of dry honey, and the sky was the impossible blue of a Kansas autumn, and the wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves that looked like the breathing of something enormous. She heard Gilbert's horse before she saw him, the particular easy rhythm of the roan coming in from the east pasture. He came around the corner of the barn and saw her on the porch and raised a hand, and she raised her coffee cup, and he rode over and swung down with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his body and on his land. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked out at the prairie, and she handed him what was left of her coffee without being asked, and he drank it, which was a gesture so habitual and domestic and true that she felt it in the center of herself. "Good morning out there," he said. "Good here too," she said. They stood together in the October light looking at the land. 10 years, 3 children, 1 store, 1 ranch. One marriage that had grown each year into something larger and more settled and more itself. The way good things grow, not by accumulation of new things, but by deepening of what is already there. She leaned her shoulder against his and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the morning sun with the coffee cup between them and the prairie breathing its slow October breath. "I was thinking," she said. "Always significant," he said. "That I would like to plant more sunflowers next year," she said. "Along the east fence as well, not just the south." He considered this with appropriate gravity. "That is a significant expansion of the sunflower operation. I believe the ranch can handle it." "I believe you are right," he said. She smiled. The horizon was immense and golden and entirely hers. The eastern parcel of Caldwell Flats had good grass along the creek and was excellent for cattle in the spring. The fence line was maintained and extended over the years by Gilbert and James and Tom Briggs and Eddie Marsh, and later by other hands as the operation grew. The creek ran different every year, high in wet springs, low in dry summers, and the cattle grazed the grass and the grass came back, and the land endured in the quiet, indifferent way of land. In the deed at the Caldwell County Courthouse, the eastern parcel of Caldwell Flats was recorded as the property of Gilbert Watkins, transferred from Chester Vaughn by agreement in the year 1873, consideration consisting of water rights and a promissory note in the amount agreed. The description of the consideration contained no other items, no names except those of the 2 men. No mention of a woman's name between a land clause and a water rights clause, because the document that had contained such a thing had been torn into 4 pieces and left on a land agent's desk on an August morning in 1873, and the world had been fractionally better for it. The 4 pieces of paper had long since been swept away. The land remained. The house remained. The family in it remained. James Watkins grew into the man who managed the ranch alongside his father and eventually took primary responsibility for it, a serious and careful man with his mother's green eyes and his father's patience. He married a woman from Wichita named Helen in 1892 and brought her to Caldwell, and the ranch grew again to accommodate the new life. Clara Watkins became a teacher, which surprised no one who had spent any time with her at age 7, and she taught in the Caldwell School for many years and was known for her enthusiasm and her complete inability to be boring. She married late, at 25, a man named Samuel Cole who was a newspaper editor and had strong opinions about everything, which meant the 2 of them got along extraordinarily well. William Watkins took after his mother in the business sense and eventually helped expand Watkins Dry Goods into a second location in the next town, working alongside Ruth Garfield's eldest daughter, whom he eventually married, to the profound satisfaction of both families. Mrs. Clara Dean lived to 81 and received a letter from Alma every month until the end. She wrote back in increasingly small, careful handwriting, and the letters were warm and funny and wise, and Alma kept them all in a box in the bedroom under the east window. Chester Vaughn was last heard of in Colorado in 1876 and then not heard of again, which was, on balance, the appropriate conclusion. Horace Plum retired from the land office in 1880 and moved to Kansas City. He did not tear up any further documents, but he also did not include any further women in property transfers, which may have been a lesson absorbed or simply the law catching up, and either way the outcome was the same. Gilbert Watkins fixed the porch boards in 1885 when they began to rot, and the porch was subsequently excellent in an upgraded sense. He put in a window box under the kitchen window in 1887, which Alma filled with herbs. He built a second bookshelf in 1889 when the first one could hold no more, and the two bookshelves stood side by side and were filled entirely by 1892. He and Alma sat on the front porch most evenings when the weather allowed, in chairs that were now 4 in number to accommodate the children when they visited, and they watched the Kansas sky do what the Kansas sky does: change constantly, dramatically, with complete indifference to human opinion, performing sunsets of extravagant beauty that neither of them ever fully stopped noticing. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, in March of 1893, they sat on the porch in the early spring chill with a blanket between them and the prairie beginning its first green, and the creek audible in the distance running full. He reached over and took her hand, which he did often and she always let him, and he held it in the easy certain way of 20 years. 20, he said. 20, she agreed. Are you happy? He asked. He still asked sometimes. She had never minded. She looked at the spring prairie and the wide sky and the fence line James had maintained and the east window where the light came in every morning and the south fence where the sunflowers would be enormous by August. Completely, she said. Specifically, completely happy. He turned her hand over in his and traced the line of her palm with his thumb, which he had always done when he was being tender, and she felt it the way she felt everything from him, with the full specific attention of a woman who had spent 20 years paying attention to the exact details of the man she loved, and had not yet run out of things to notice. I love you, he said. I love you, she said. The spring evening settled around them. The first stars appeared in the deep blue above the prairie. Inside the house there were voices. James and Helen had come for the anniversary, and Clara and Samuel and William had come from the next town, and the house was full of the noise and life it had been built for, that it had held for 20 years, that it would hold for 20 more. The creek ran. The cattle grazed. The prairie breathed its slow, enormous breath. On an August morning 20 years ago, a woman had sat on a bench outside a land office with a carpetbag between her boots and $4.60, waiting to find out how bad the next thing was going to be. The next thing had been a man who crouched down to her level on the plank sidewalk and told her she was not property, and tore up a piece of paper and changed the direction of everything. The next thing had been the rest of her life. She had built it herself, with her own hands and her own clear mind and her own fierce, quiet strength, and she had built it alongside a man who was worth every single thing she had allowed herself, finally, to want. The March evening was cool, and the stars were extraordinary, and Gilbert Watkins held his wife's hand on the porch of the house he had built, and Alma Watkins watched the sky and felt the full, irreducible weight of a life that was entirely, specifically, completely hers. Inside, James said something that made Helen laugh, and Clara said something that made everyone laugh, and William knocked something over and apologized, and the sounds came out through the curtained windows into the evening air, and Alma smiled with her whole face in the dark, and Gilbert squeezed her hand, and they sat together in the good silence of people who have come home to each other so many times that home is not a place anymore but a state that travels with them, that they carry in each other. The stars came out one by one above the Kansas prairie, indifferent and magnificent, the same stars that had looked down on the bench and the carpetbag and the land office and the torn paper and the two people who had, against the considerable odds of the world they lived in, found each other and held on. They held on still. They intended to hold on a good while longer. The spring sunflowers would be along both fences this year, south and east both, and they were going to be enormous.